More than a year ago, French President Emmanuel Macron tried but failed to convince Russian leader Vladimir Putin not to invade Ukraine. Now he is in Beijing trying his luck with China's top brass. On the one hand, saying they could play peacemaker, on the other, warning about, quote, helping the aggressor. And then adding a dose of pragmatism, saying Europe must not separate from China economically.
French President Emmanuel Macron is on a delicate diplomatic visit to China, his first trip since 2019. He's warned that Europe must resist eroding trade and diplomatic ties with Beijing, while hailing the major role that China could play in forging peace in Ukraine.
Et la Chine, justement, a proposé un plan de paix. Nous l'avons salué. Est-ce que nous nous y retrouvons dans son intégralité? Non. Néanmoins, il a un intérêt, il montre une volonté de s'engager sur la résolution du conflit. Et donc, s'il ne s'agit pas d'un plan de paix, il s'agit bien d'une volonté d'avoir une responsabilité, d'essayer de bâtir un chemin vers la paix et, je l'espère, de pouvoir participer à des initiatives utiles à la population ukrainienne. Et donc, je pense que ce dialogue avec la Chine est indispensable. Parce que nous, Européens de l'Union européenne, nous aurions tort de laisser l'exclusivité du dialogue à la Chine à d'autres Européens continentaux que sont les Russes.
Mr. Macron will be joined by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for the talks in Beijing. The pair will be meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping and other top officials tomorrow.
How China continues to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor for EU-China relations going forward.
Ahead of the landmark trip, Mr. Macron spoke to US President Joe Biden. The two leaders have agreed to engage China to help accelerate the end of Russia's war in Ukraine.
And for more on this story, Ross Cullen joins us live from Paris. Ross, Mr. Macron says he's not in China to negotiate peace in Ukraine, but he's still hoping China will help him on that matter. What is he hoping to achieve when he meets President Xi?
Yeah, well, good evening, Wei Su, and good evening, Dawn. We heard there French President Emmanuel Macron in that speech that he was giving, the first event since he touched down in China earlier today in Beijing, in the capital, for an event for the French community living in China, and laying out a general picture of how he sees the next 2.5 days going of this visit to China, with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, joining him as well for that joint trip. He was clear about Ukraine. This is going to be a major issue during this trip. We already knew that before the visit even began. Last week, Ursula von der Leyen gave a pretty scathing speech where she was saying that how China interacts with Putin's war will be a defining factor for EU-China relations. And then on Tuesday, the 4th of April, Emmanuel Macron had a call with Joe Biden, the US president, where they both agreed on that collective will to try to engage China to accelerate an end to the war in Ukraine. That was what was said before the trip, making it very clear that Ukraine is going to be a key topic. Now the trip is underway. We've already had Emmanuel Macron saying that there is a shared responsibility between the European Union broadly, France specifically, and China to try to work towards a peace in Ukraine, with Emmanuel Macron saying that China has a, quote, major role to play in trying to achieve peace in Ukraine.
Ross, of course, it's not just Ukraine on the agenda. Mr. Macron is traveling with about 50 business leaders from big companies in France. Trade, a very big issue. He said trade relations with China are not balanced. On this trip, how does he hope to rebalance these so-called unbalanced trade ties?
Well, the European Union imports far more from China than China imports from the European Union. So there are a couple of ways that Emmanuel Macron will be hoping to try to address that imbalance, either by focusing more on producing in Europe what Europe needs. This ties back to the problems exposed by the coronavirus pandemic, particularly the end of 2019 as we all, as a globe, went into 2020. The global supply chain issues, seeing how much the European Union relies on China for things that it needs. Can the European Union, and France specifically, provide what they need here in the EU at home? Another route that they could try to pursue is by increasing the exports coming from the European Union to China. Also, as you mentioned, those business executives, dozens of them accompanying the French president and the European Commission president on their trip, looking to try to expand investment by French businesses inside China. Just some 10 days ago, Airbus announced the completion of the first assembly in China of its new A321neo jet. And so there's an example there of a Europe-wide company which is headquartered here in the south of France in Toulouse, Airbus. But also the oil and gas giant Total has a lot of operations in China, particularly on gas, biofuels and on solar production. And there are many other international standard French firms, from Alstom in transport and engineering to L'Oreal and in cosmetics and Michelin in tyres, that will be looking to try to secure new commercial deals and new contracts during the trip.
Our thanks to that. Ross Cullen reporting live to us there from Paris.